Quickly, if you recall last year, Paul sort of stepped back from his duties in pulling this session together and gave me the reins for a little while. And I think part of that thought process was stepping back and getting some perspective on how to improve this session. I think that pulling back as he did, gave him a bit of insight and perspective, and what he really did sort of embodies the theme of this conference, which is Vision 2020 and beyond. So it gave Paul a renewed enthusiasm and energy, and he brought some new things and certainly purpose to this meeting and to this session, working along with Elaine and I. And so it shows. We have some new features here today. I was going to say in the back of the room, but they're in the front of the room, a poster session, which is very similar to Suboptic, and with their help and certainly with their support, we've incorporated some of the most hot topics in our industry today. So those posters will be featured all day, and first and foremost, we'll have a Monday session from 3:30 to 4:45 in South Pacific 1. And each one of the poster sessions will have a bit of time to talk through some of the detail. So please make sure to attend that. This year we've changed the Around the World portion just a little bit and made it a little bit more discussion-based. I think that you'll find it a little bit different, but we've added quite a few experts, and I think some of the trends and challenges and drivers that you see in Subsea will come out today, not only regionally, but certainly globally. There's always been a very strong complementary relationship between satellite and submarine cables, and today we'll cover some of that evolution and certainly some of the interdependence between the two. There are a lot of common themes that occur when operating networks, and it doesn't matter if it's a small unrepeated system or a large transoceanic system. There is a lot of commonality, and in Elaine's panel, she'll explore some of that a little later on this morning. I can honestly say that the pace of change in this industry is breathtaking. The demand for more information is really insatiable. There's over $10 trillion of economic activity in the things that we do as a collective industry, in the about 450 or so submarine cables. I think that number is debatable and changes quite a bit, but, and I guess we'll find out a little bit more later about some of those new things. But to sum that up, and I don't know where we are today. Are we at petabyte, exabytes? I'm not sure what it is, but there really is an incredible amount of demand that's out there. And we'll talk about how the industry is going to meet those demands in the future, and Eric Contag will have his panel a little later that will address that. So with that as backdrop for today's session, it's my pleasure to introduce one of the giants in the industry to moderate the first session, the president and co-founder of APT, Mr. Sean Bergen. So if you'll give him a round of applause. Thank you. And I'll let you introduce your panel. Oh, by the way, I do have a timer this year because I got the look last year from Elaine when I went over, and most of you know what that look is like. So we're going to stay on time this year. But thank you all very much, and enjoy the day.
Thanks, Tony. Well, I'll introduce our panellists, but I don't really think they need much of an introduction, these guys. But we'll start down this end. We have Nigel Bailiff, as you all know, the CEO of Aquacomms. Next to him, we have who do we have? We have Kent. We have Kent Bressy. He's a partner and head of international practice at Wiltshire Grannis. And then we have Byron Clatterbuck. He's the CEO of CCOM. And right down the end there, we have Helen Wong, and she's the Director of Product and Partner Strategy at Verizon for Asia.
And then Miss...
This gentleman here,
Oh, sorry, Ed. You're sort of hiding in the background there. Yeah, so we've got Ed McCormick, and he's a senior international advisor from Sienna. Sorry, Ed.
Gonna happen.
Faded into the background.
Nothing personal. Okay, so to kick things off, I suppose, just a high... We're going to focus on an around-the-world discussion here, and we've got experts from all around the world here, so it's a great panel. I think at a high level, though, what we're looking at the moment is something like 40-plus builds. There's over 40 builds in discussion or being planned, and it's at the serious point of progress currently around the globe. That's a lot. That's a lot. There's a lot of talk about the market potentially turning, but conversely, we're seeing significant build activity out there, or planned build activity out there, which is great news for our industry. I mean, in the Pacific in particular, there's a massive amount of activity going on right now, not just Trans-Pacific, but also in the Pacific Islands. We'll talk about that as well. And there seems to be an increased focus on India and Africa at the moment as well, in particular, which we'll get Byron to talk about. There's also some new routes coming up that haven't been built yet, so the old gap on the map sort of approach. So we're seeing, talk of things happening out of Chile. We're seeing talk of things happening around the Arctic again. We're also seeing a massive shift with the technology, and we talk about trends. If you look at all the new builds, particularly the transoceanic builds, most of them are very, very high fibre counts and with very high capacity per fibre. So it'll be interesting to get a view from these people in terms of what that really means moving forward when these systems come into service. So I suppose, without further ado, let's kick off. I'll start with Byron, actually. Let's talk about Africa a little bit.
Thank you, Sean.
No problem. Yeah. We'll pull a map up so you can all see what we're talking about with regard to...
where Africa is. We know
Yeah.
where it is. Okay.
Actually, have you seen those street interviews where they ask people where certain countries are and nobody has a clue? If you look at the map there, you can see there's a massive amount of activity on both coasts. So Byron, what's your take? I mean, and in particular, to frame it up a little bit, we're seeing builds coming out of places like Pakistan, that corner of the world, through to Africa. We're looking at people from Australia looking to come up to the Middle East. What's going on?
Yeah, maybe just by way of introduction, I'm the CEO of CECOM. CECOM was one of the first private cable systems in Africa, so a two-fiber pair system down the east coast of Africa, and have been in operation about 10 years. Since then, there's been two other really high-speed terabit-capable cables, the Easy cable and the wax cable on the west coast that came in 2012 in Africa. But when you look at it from that perspective, 1.3 billion people, 54 nations, 16 of which are landlocked, there really are not many cables into Africa, high-speed cables into Africa. So yeah, we are seeing a lot of activity that after 2009, you had a few cables built, 2012, and then it's been a large gap before anything's really happened. So now you're seeing a lot in the news, I'm sure, of a cable. Equiano's been announced, the Google cable, which is a 16-fiber pair system on the west coast. There's some other not officially announced cables that are also high fiber count cables on the east and west coast that are coming. And then you have, I would call those regional gap filler cables like Peace, which is coming from Pakistan into North Africa, and the DARE cable system, which is kind of coming from Djibouti down to Mombasa, at least is phase one. So yeah, there's quite a bit of activity, but it's been a long gap between that activity happening in Africa. And I would say the other kind of interesting challenge with Africa, maybe as opposed to some other places or other continents, is that there's really no terrestrial fiber that goes across Africa. So if you wanted to connect the east coast of Africa with the west coast of Africa, you would not be able to do that any other way aside from a subsea routing. So.
Okay, so you talked about wax and you talked about a couple of other easy. One thing I've noticed over the last probably 5 years is the price in Africa. So if we look at wax, for example, the male points have gone from something like $20 a kilometre down to about $2 a kilometre. So in an environment like that, does it get tough to justify the build cost economics? Do they stack up still?
Yeah, I think that is a challenge because I think really the infrastructure that's required, and you say that price has dropped from a cable station in Europe to a cable station in South Africa, the prices have dropped radically. But there's a lot of markets where you want to access that wax capacity. The costs are still very, very high, just because the cross-connect charges and the interconnect charges are so high in many markets. So wax, while it's there and you can buy MALs, when you actually want to utilize those MALs and deploy them into African countries, aside from open competitive markets like South Africa, it cost is very high.
And
so you do need additional cost reductions, and you also need diversity to those cable systems.
Right, and we've seen Djibouti come a long way in the last few years as well. I mean, how many cables are coming into Djibouti now?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of cables coming into Djibouti, and obviously it's a very good cross-connect business for Djibouti Telecom. They're the monopoly operator there. But again, I think the challenge there is that even cross-connects in Djibouti, you're getting to a point where the cross-connect in Djibouti's cable station is getting to about 30% of the price for a circuit between Johannesburg and London. So that becomes more and more of a hurdle for the carriers who have those cables that land into Djibouti. We land in Djibouti, but we don't have to cross-connect in Djibouti. Thank goodness for that. But
Okay. All right, so let's move up north a little bit. Nigel, let's talk about the Atlantic a little bit and the Arctic perhaps as well, while we're up that neck of the woods. We talk about high fibre count cables. And with some of the technology I'll ask Ed to talk about soon coming on board with not just high fibre count, but high capacity. What do you see happening in the Atlantic? Because there's always a fear that the prices were so depressed that it just didn't make sense to build cables anymore.
Well, that's a good start, isn't it?
morning, everyone.
Sorry for being late. I was checking if there'd been any bankruptcies overnight. And what had happened in the hourly price decline. But actually, I think the Atlantic is actually stabilizing a little bit compared to, just look at the number of systems on that map that are, for example, being built across the Pacific. And I'm glad I'm not talking about that, because there's a lot of fiber pairs there newly going to go into the water across the Pacific. But the Atlantic, I think, obviously we know that the hyperscalers are building multi-core, and even they're driving the SDM capability to build more cables. That's kind of reducing the resilience of the Atlantic from 14 or so strands to maybe 7, 8, 9. But also, if you looked back at Suboptic at the growth rate still on that one singular route, the Atlantic, of course, a lot of the stuff comes up through the Mediterranean, goes across the Atlantic. So it's a very, very high transit route as well. And one of the things I'm concerned about, and we can perhaps all talk about it in the different regions, is the supply side, because I think the telegeography prediction was 41 systems in 15 years. And that's quite a substantial amount. There's 40 maybe in play now. We don't see particularly anybody new entering the supply side of the industry, and it's also quite hard for the supply side perhaps to get capital to expand their facilities, their factories, and buy more installation vessels, simply because the price is depressed because there's been this high volume building of various things. I think all of these markets are trending towards the same position, which is that you can't really build things on your own. Nobody can really build things on their own. There has to be a combination. There are a few huge users and consumers of fiber pairs on oceanic routes, but that was kind of always the case. There used to be PTTs 30 years ago. They now happen to be a different group of people. What that growth has done is generated a bunch of efficiency around how many fibers you can operate in a cable. But really, for the carriers and for the parties that are operating what I call the rump, the piece that isn't used by the private networks, is about efficiency. So you really have to be super, super, super efficient in operating the part of the capacity that's used for general communications and carriers. And we see people come into the market who are new starters actually buying into some of these markets at a higher level than the traditional carriers. So there has been a switch round in who the customers are, but it's really all about overall efficiency, managing the debt, the amount of debt of sitting on top of a cable for its life, and managing out as quickly as possible. And, you know, although I was trying to be humorous about the bankruptcies, there are bankruptcies happening and have happened on the Atlantic, you know, fairly recently and probably will continue to do so. But new cables are needed. The older cables, therefore, you know, will find it harder to compete and will roll off. That's a natural cycle. If you're in the old ones and not in the new ones, that's maybe a disadvantage. But, you know, I think it's still a generally, you know, buoyant and useful market. I don't know if you're going to ask a question about the regional thing on there. There's a whole range of things, simply because there aren't as many strands, perhaps, in the Atlantic being built. There's a kind of a capillarity network developing, particularly and on both sides of the Atlantic. The Worley cable, you know, is connecting together some cable heads, and the regional build-outs of Celtic North, NOUK, etc., North Sea Connect, all of those cables into mainland Europe from Ireland and the UK and Spain. You know, it's just trying to create the mesh that allows people to access those big cable heads, of which there are now fewer.
It's not a lot different in that context to Southeast Asia, really.
Yeah.
So, Nigel, the Atlantic was pretty much the first market that, you know, Johnny Raincloud again, but the Atlantic was the first market to sort of come down to a price point that no one thought it would ever get to. Do you think that there's lessons to be learned in models moving forward, particularly when you look at the Pacific? You know, pricing's still pretty high relative to the Atlantic. Do you think there's lessons to be learned in the context of business models that people need to look at employing to be sustainable?
I think only in that main point, which is people ought to club together to build systems, because otherwise the diversity mix, if you have a purely private system in these markets where there's the huge, you know, price declination on both capacity services and on fibre pair pricing because of volumes of build, working together helps to insulate everybody a little bit, you know, away from that. And maybe there'll be a layering of the industry or a lamination where, you know, there's some infrastructure layer players, there's some, you know, terrestrial layer players, there's some service layer players, and then there's some, you know, right on the top, the consumer, IoT, you know, fine definition stuff. So there's groups of people who'll become specialists in each of those fields. And I think, you know, we have just decided to focus only on subsea as an organisation. There's a few other organisations around the world that do that, and that seems to be, you know, allow us to deploy, you know, everything and all our energy around making that efficient, rather than blending it with mobiles or, you know, other sectors in the industry.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Nigel. So we've looked at Africa, we've looked at Europe. Have you got any comments to make on the Arctic whilst we're at it?
It's a lot colder than it is here, but it's. I mean, over the last 30 years, roughly every 10 years, there's been a cycle of let's have a look at the Arctic, and I think, you know, what everybody understands around global warming and the lack of ice and the amount of ice-free period over both sides of the Arctic, both the the American side and the Russian Federation side, is likely to lead to more builds there. Obviously, we've seen Quintillion deploy in Alaska, which was, you know, a couple of years ago now. There's routes open through the Northwest Passage. There's routes open over the on the Russian side of the Arctic there. So I think it will happen, but it'll be for a specific bunch of users. You know, people who are looking for maybe latency in the sea as opposed to, you know, going across a lot of landmass, or coming the more traditional way and going on a multiplicity of systems and through the you know, across the Egypt there. So yeah, I would say, you know, next couple of years there'll be real projects starting to do real work. I mean, there's lots of press and discussion and conversation about it, and generally where there are 4 or 5 people looking at doing something, then at least one will happen.
Okay, that'll be interesting to watch, because I think one of the key issues isn't just the challenge of laying a cable in those waters. The challenge is going to be repairs as well. So the cost of ownership is going to be quite high, I'd imagine, on anyone who did that route, because they're going to have their own vessels.
Yeah, I mean, it changes the map in terms of where you need to have deployable maintenance vessels, but there are some places in the world where it's hard to fix cables now, you know, off Gibraltar, you know, coming down through the Labrador Channel. You know, those are difficult places to fix, do repairs in certain times of the year. Obviously, Luzon is a difficult place sometimes. So, you know, I don't think it's necessarily any worse. Arguably, there's less external hazards in terms of fishing and shipping, although it is actually an active shipping lane now over the Russian Arctic. So.
Just have to avoid the submarines, eh? So, moving on to Helen, let's have a chat about the Pacific and Asia. It's a hotbed of activity at the moment. I mean, there's at least 8 talked about, planned, in progress, stalled systems happening right now. It's pretty amazing to watch when you consider at the moment that realistically people are in a position to use AAG, but that's pretty much full. PC'1's, older than I am a lot, probably 2 times or more, without saying too much. So that's one of the reasons why the pricing in the Pacific's maintained its health. I mean, you're still looking, $30,000 to $40,000 a month for a 100 gig wave between Hong Kong and LA. So it's a really healthy market. In other markets off similar routes, you're sort of seeing a price 1/5 of that. So what's going to happen, in your opinion, Helen, across the Pacific? Let's start with that.
Well, actually, Asia is always an exciting place to be because with the growth, I guess coming more from what the business drivers behind all the content and the traffic that's needed across Asia and Pacific is where you actually we're still continuously seeing growth in a lot of healthy growth in the data side. So if you look at the cable system, a lot of the content I guess are still going back to the US. So you have got that drive for that Pacific capacity growth. You're talking about cable system older than you. Yes, I recall the Gesaurus, the CMU-E3 and all that, and you're wondering where they are now compared to what we're building today that is in the order of now 8 pairs of fibers in any of the cables we lay. And we're talking about building, 16 pairs, 32 pairs of fibers into some of those cable systems. So there's a lot of that is driven by the technology on what some of these builds can give us in terms of capacity. So I guess there's always a question, I know we talked about it as well, Sean, on how we're going to balance between the Pacific growth in cables versus the intra-Asia capacity. And we are seeing a lot of good health growth in the South Asia countries. If you look at it, that's always very, I see that between your Mekong region, your actually Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, then down to Philippines. Actually, Philippines in the last few years has seen some really good growth in demands as well. So you actually do see some of these new cables coming up are touching those areas, but you still got the 2 main hubbing point, I guess, from Japan to Singapore being the 2 locations where a lot of the cables are being bring into. So the look around the region is where else can we build, how can we achieve some of the diversity from a landing and a transit perspective to share that. And the other, obviously Australia is a big part until recently. The cables into Australia has always been an issue from the west side and also even from the east side. So there are a lot of new cables around that area, but still going to the US. So I guess the talk is how can we get people kind of to put more in the intra-Asia region. But obviously cost is a factor, like you said, the cost still. Cost and also the I guess the breakages around the Southeast Asia regions with trawlers and so forth still becomes an issue on that as well. And don't forget Paul McCann's love in the Pacific Islands as well, right? So until 5 years ago or so, you haven't heard that cables are being built there. So if you look at the coverage around from the Solomon Islands to the Samoa and all that, that's very exciting to find new routes that going through that with like Southern Cross next that would go up to the US through those areas as well.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of exciting things happening on the Pacific Islands right now. A lot of islands getting connected that didn't have connectivity or had very limited connectivity. I think, though, Helen, if we look at what's happening across the Pacific, my math says there's around 50 fibre pairs, about 700 terabit of potential capacity. If we look at what's happening in Southeast Asia, you've got SJC2, which was oversubscribed, so there's another bill that's being looked at there. But it seems to me we've got this massive pipe coming across the Pacific, or bunch of pipes coming across the Pacific, and realistically there's not a lot of systems that can support the distribution of that beyond, say, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, and that triangle. Ourselves at AP Telecom, we literally are still selling APCN2 and Japan US, to give you an idea of, you know, the age of systems that people are still buying capacity on. There just, to me, doesn't appear to be enough. Intra-Asia at the moment, Vietnam, 100 million people, Thailand, 70 million people. You know, move over to India, you know, you've got the second largest economy in the world nearly. So do we see opportunity here rather than maybe it's the only part of the world that's not being overbuilt right now?
I guess to your point that it's not overbuilt, but there is some terrestrial type of cable system around that is taking away a little bit of the pressure on the submarine side. So you know that between Thailand and that area, there are capacity around more on the terrestrial side. But going over to India is also actually that's also interesting. So we're trying to like set up, I guess leveraging on the CME 5 and so forth on 100 gig capacity turn up on the Europe side, because there's always been, we have more going towards the east than we ever had to the west as well. So that kind of would take, we're trying to, I can see that there's a trend to get that European traffic flow directly rather than going through the Pacific to get there. But yes, we need more cables around the region, obviously. Bear in mind, there are two. The drivers, we talk about, I think, mentioned that IoT on that data traffic. Then don't forget that with the hyperscalers as well, and if you look at the investor mix around the cable system, it's not your traditional telco providers anymore, right? So a lot of where traffic will go, people will go, I guess traffic will go where people go, and that's where all your content will be driving that. So we are seeing some of the hyperscalers setting up like zones even in Indonesia and areas, because they, I guess, having been able to localize some of the data, that might help them to actually not having to route all the traffic instantly around as well. So that's some of the, I guess you are seeing where we got cable system, people will use it, but where we don't, there's other ways on seeing how we can get the content closer to our users.
Yeah. So there's two things you mentioned there. The first one, I call it the CLMVT region, so Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam and Thailand. So to a large extent, that can be addressed from Thailand, because Thailand touches pretty much all of those countries, apart from Vietnam, obviously. But that can be addressed terrestrially to a large extent. But I want to talk about India for a moment. Maybe Byron, maybe you're the best one to talk to this. Historically, we've seen India look westward, largely, for connectivity to places like Marseille and others. With the build activity happening now with MIST, you know, NTT, and you've got Geo, and you've also got another one called Sing, coming on board, all pointing towards Asia, do you think that there's a shift in, or is it just logical for them to start looking to bifurcate traffic?
Yeah, I think that's always been the case with India. You know, predominantly huge traffic flows through the Middle East into Europe originally, but you know, there's a lot of fiber pairs and cable capabilities between India's east coast and Asia, mostly into Singapore. So yeah, I think certainly when you look at from a global position, going east or going west out of India makes quite a bit of sense. And I think that as you see kind of the growing hub capabilities and data center development and what material content and compute power is put in places like Singapore or Hong Kong, then it obviously makes sense to connect into those centers as well as connecting into whether it's Dubai or into London or Marseille, as you mentioned. So yeah, I think you see that certainly, and that will continue. Yeah. But I think what we haven't really seen, and we obviously, CCOM, we connect from Africa into India, and we always thought that route would develop, and that's been 10 years that we've had that fiber route from India into Africa, and we really haven't seen that develop. But again, that probably goes to the fact that really, is there much trade directly between India and Africa, which there is not that much, and are those cloud centers in Africa and India that would like to exchange data? And I don't think they really exist today. So people tend to hub where that is, and in Africa you're seeing kind of South Africa, Kenya and East Africa, and Nigeria and West Africa as kind of hubs that want to connect more and more. And maybe that will develop as maybe if Mumbai becomes more of a hub, as an example.
Okay, based on that rationale, where does peace and DARE fit into that scenario?
Yeah, well, I think the idea of peace was the whole China Belt and Road Initiative to go from China, get through Pakistan, and be able to connect into Africa and even onward into Europe. So have an alternative route for China to get to Europe, like it did through Russia, et cetera, as opposed to all going across the Pacific. DARE is more of a regional play to get Mombasa up to Djibouti to feed a lot of the big cables that Djibouti Telecom happens to be landing. They are coming through Asia into Europe. But again, that DARE only comes down into Mombasa, and Mombasa has become quite a hub. But again, once you get into Mombasa on the east coast of Kenya, you've got to get out of Mombasa and go somewhere else. And that's the challenge, really.
Okay, so just moving away from routes for a minute and some of the trends like high capacity fibre counts, etc. I want to just touch on a few things with Ed. Ed's in a very unique position. Obviously he's going to sell a lot of cards. So Ed's got a fair bit of insight into the existing environment in terms of who's doing well and who's activating a lot of capacity. Obviously we're not going to be naming systems, but certainly it'd be interesting to get, Ed, your insight into which paths, which regions are doing really well from a current system perspective. Active systems, not these new ones, I want to talk about that also, but not yet. But which routes are doing really, really well, which regions?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I suppose we started by talking about the growth level around the world. We started by kind of acknowledging, if you like, the fairly dramatic improvement in the economics of submarine networking and the contribution they're making to the world. And so I think to me, it's not so much about technology anymore, because the technologists have done brilliantly, whether it is in submarine wet plant builds or whether it is in equipping those. Because even in the last 10 years, on the wet plant side, for example, we've seen the first joint build agreement, we've seen smart branching units, we've seen wider amplifiers, we've seen C&L band, we've seen SDM cables, and we've seen open cables. Absolutely dramatic improvements. On equipping them, we've moved away from, and 10 years ago, primarily a 10 gig environment to a 40 gig, to 100 gig, 200 gig, 400 gig, on the way to 800 gig over long distances, and to a terabit and more. So the technology is doing its job. I think that the countries and the locations that do well are where the environment allows the technology to be deployed. And to just go back to what Byron said, sometimes you can have the best system in the world, or many of them, but if you can't get out of Djibouti, it's not a lot of good to you. And where countries have opened up, and it started from the US east and west, those locations have done very well in terms of installing huge amounts of bandwidth at ever-decreasing price points, providing diversity. New cables were built, legacy cables had their life extended, the economics of those improved. And really you're left in locations like Africa, you're left in Middle East, you're left in India, where the regulation has been lagging to capitalize on all those. And I think this is the last frontier, and I think this is where you're going to see business models changing to accommodate the kind of investment that's planned and badly needed. Because after all, India is the largest country in the world. Africa has as big a population as China. The Middle East has very high per capita incomes. So I think in the next few years you will see those locations, making an effort to catch up with the rest of the world by breaking down the barriers and enabling the technology to be deployed.
Okay, Ed, so on that basis, let's get back to the question I asked you for a moment.
Yeah.
Which routes or regions are currently doing really, really well in terms of your shipping cards to this part of the world more so than others?
So to date, without any doubt, the Atlantic is the largest route in terms of optical deployments. That doesn't mean it's actually the most lucrative route or has the highest demand, because it's a point-to-point system. You would require a lot more equipment building an intra-Asia system. I think the Pacific is also, I would say, booming right now. What I see in Asia is that open cables and cables where there's individual fiber ownership, there are upgrades going on those on an almost continuous basis. And the days when you could do an upgrade in a year, customers simply don't want to know about that. They want smaller, more continuous upgrades. And you can be working on a single cable for 3 or 4 customers around the year.
Okay, it's something else you mentioned was new business models. I mean, we've seen the advent of JBAs in the last probably 7 or 8 years. Is that what you're referring to, or do you anticipate evolving business models occurring to get these cables over the line and in the water?
I think the new model is very different from the ones of 20 years ago, like FLAG. The new model is about jointly owned cables, owned under a JBA, where the individual investors have control over their part of the investment. It could be actual fiber, it could be spectrum. There's nothing to stop multiple vendors coexisting on a single fiber today. And so it means that when you have multiple owners on the same cable, each one has less capital exposed. But there will also be more competition than is immediately obvious. That's going to drive prices down, and it's going to push the growth in the system faster.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Now we've covered off Africa, Europe, we've covered off Asia Pac. I'd like to, and we've also covered off technology to an extent with Ed. I'd like to move over to Kent and talk about frameworks and regulatory issues. As most folks are aware, there are quite a few of those issues at the moment, particularly related to the Pacific, and we'll get to that in a minute. I'm sure everyone's interested to hear what Kent has to say about that. But to start with, I thought with all of this activity, and there are additional planned builds to occur to the US right now, both from the Atlantic and the Pacific side. Kent, can you give an overview of the process, a high-level overview of the process that folks need to go through with regard to regulatory environment in the US and when they should start that process? Well, it's a long pole in the tent, obviously, in most cases, but if you could give a high-level overview of what people need to go through, that'd be a great place for us to start this chat.
Sure, and I was just going to start by noting that this is but one element of increasing regulatory risk and greater regulatory uncertainty. It's something that we're seeing globally with submarine cables, but some particular issues with the United States that make it more challenging and in some cases less appealing to build there. And these regulatory risks we see in areas of security, environmental regulation, issues with deep seabed mining, and just general permitting times for new builds and for repairs. And with respect to environment and mining, which I'll talk about a little later, I'll be speaking in my capacity as the legal advisor for the International Cable Protection Committee, which is not providing a separate update at this workshop this year, but I'll address that separately. So the Team Telecom process is the national security review that goes along with the telecoms licensing for a new system that lands in the US. And it drives the timing and the regulatory risk in the process. It's not the FCC. And so here, and we actually have a version control issue I see. The 3 bars that you see on the far right for JGA South, Southern Cross Next, and HKG should be the striped bars. Those have not been licensed yet. I only wish we'd done that quickly. But here you have overall licensing times. The blue is the FCC part at the beginning. The pink is the national security review by the team telecom agencies. And the green is the remaining FCC action once the national security review is complete. So most of the time is for national security reviews. There's quite a bit of variation. There are particular stories that go with some of these systems. But the overall timeframes are not getting shorter, even for systems that shouldn't raise particular issues. And so for those systems that do raise greater concern, and Sean, it sounds like you want to address that a little bit later about issues with the Pacific. It's taking up agency time and resources, and it slows down almost everything else, even if your system doesn't have issues. And so what does this mean? We're advising clients building new systems to add in more time for the licensing process. It is possible in a crunch if you file relatively late and have an uncontroversial system and you're bumping up against an RFS date to get a license. I think Curry is an example of that. But that is unusual in this process. And so, although it's the FCC filings themselves, the applications that trigger the national security review, there's a lot of work that parties can and should do in advance to be prepared going into the team telecom process.
So Ken, just sorry to interrupt you, but if we took the systems out of this graph that have striped lines on them, what's the average look like for an uncontentious system?
So we're generally advising between 14 and 18 months for new systems right now. It can be possible to do it in a shorter period of time, but if you're trying to sequence all the various components, you really do need to build in that time. You don't want to have a delayed RFS date. And so, again, the concept here in going into this process, and we're starting to see other governments take an interest in this kind of national security review process. The Japanese government has started scrutinizing new system builds from a national security perspective. Of course, there's a focus on procurement. Again, I'll talk about that bundle of security issues later. And so, but the United States has long been the lead on this. During the review process, there's an increasing focus on a lot of terrestrial components that are technically not part of the submarine cable system at all, but the agencies are asking a lot of questions about them. It's much more intrusive in that regard. And post-licensing, there's a lot more burden than there used to be. There's a lot more focus on enforcement and site inspections. I'm leading a site inspection for a client next week where we have 17 government people coming. It's a big drain on resources to do that. And so it's not to discount concerns that agencies might have about security, but there has to be a balance somewhere in terms of establishing a system that has some predictability and where the obligations are not constantly going to be changing. That's another problem we see, is that every time there's a change in ownership that requires a modification of a license, the addition of a new branch, the security agencies go back and redo the conditions for the system. And so there is not consistency over time. Their view is, well, the security environment is changing, which is true, but having such great specificity in mitigation instruments ends up causing the need for constant modifications in their view, which causes a lot of problems.
So, you know, you talked about security a little bit. I mean, I'd suggest that a lot of the security issues relate to these ones with the stripes on them, and the security issues aren't only they're not US unique. I mean, it's not the US isn't the only only country in this situation. I mean, Hong Kong's a great example as well, where there's regulatory issues.
Yes, so, that's the elephant in the room here this morning, is what is going on with the US-China relationship and systems that are planned to land in Hong Kong. Everybody was chatting at Submarine Networks World about the Wall Street Journal's article about PLCN, which I don't think people both misread, and the article didn't provide necessarily accurate picture of where things stand. But there are constituencies within the Team Telecom process that believe that submarine cable operators should be disengaging from Hong Kong, and they do not want to see new systems landing, connecting the United States directly with Hong Kong. That's separate from concerns about Chinese ownership in systems, and certainly the political turmoil in Hong Kong has not helped the case for Hong Kong. But of course, Hong Kong, along with Japan and Singapore, are the three great hubs for transit traffic and peering in Asia. And a lot of carriers have built out infrastructure to connect to others in those places. So the idea that simply denying licenses for new systems is going to lead to the decline of Hong Kong as a hub, I think is a mistaken view. And so that raises a lot of other questions about whether or not systems would be built to land at intermediate points, whether it's the Philippines or Taiwan, or on the eastern side of the Pacific if systems are going to land in Canada or Mexico instead. I wrote a piece almost 7 years ago asking, is it time to land in Mexico and Canada, more focused on some of the FCC's misguided regulation with fees in particular. But now we're seeing security-related reasons for doing that. And so, with the regional snapshots that my co-panelists have provided, it's really focusing on, what are preferred routes and countries and preferred partners for building. And in some cases, particularly with security, it's harder to do that than it's been in the past.
But Ken, I mean, you mentioned potentially Canada or Mexico as alternatives to avoid this long pole in the tent. Does it really address the issue though? Because you'd be pretty naive to assume, we'll just take it to Canada and then terrestrially bring it into the US.
I think a lot of things are on the table right now. In this industry, new system developers have typically proceeded with manufacturing and installation activities before having all of their permits in principle. As an infrastructure business, that's unusual. You don't see that in a lot of other infrastructure businesses. It raises questions about whether or not the industry is going to have to rethink how it handles permitting if it's going to suddenly confront these massive back-end risks where government agencies, well aware of projects proceeding for more than a year, suddenly decide, we're not sure we can license this. You can end up with systems actually already being built without a license. And so I think that raises a lot of challenging questions for the industry about how to sequence things.
Well, it certainly raises a question for me. I mean, if I look at, let's talk about PLCN standing out there, isn't it? One of the key commercial considerations when you're building a new cable is the delta between SIF and RFS. The older or the longer it takes, there's been a lot of pricing pressure applied to the vendors, and the price of building new systems keeps coming down. So if you committed to a vendor 3 years ago, I bet you now the price has come down to build exactly the same system, a lot. So those guys are at a massive, if they got approved tomorrow, they're still at a massive competitive disadvantage to the market. And I just don't know how that could actually be addressed. So that delta between SIF and RFS is incredibly crucial. And the systems that have very low deltas in that regard tend to do okay commercially.
I'm not going to comment on PLCN.
Okay.
I represent one of the owners.
All right, well, I tried. Anyway. it was a bad example. I could have said Jupiter.
Can we just show the second slide briefly? Because this is for new builds. There's, of course, M&A activity and new investment.
Yep.
And we see wildly different review timelines for regulatory approvals, for M&A transactions involving submarine cable operators. And some of these are driven by the fact that the submarine cable component is but a small part of a larger transaction, for example, T-Mobile Sprint. But some of these operators have a bigger submarine cable component. You'll also see that some of these reviews, the ones principally with only green and blue bars, were not subject to Team Telecom reviews. They're generally shorter. So it's not just planning with new builds, but if you're engaged in M&A transactions and you're going to have to go through, in most cases, a separate national security review in addition to an FCC review. I was just going to note briefly, I mean, we talk a lot about Team Telecom and Team Telecom-like processes that other countries might be trying to echo, but there are a lot of other things going on right now that potentially affect this industry in the national security space that are not Team Telecom. And it potentially relates or affects new non-controlling investment, acquisitions or leasing of real estate in the U.S., procurement or upgrading of equipment and software for providers that have government contracts that provide services to the U.S. government, procurement restrictions, and those that rely on subsidies from the Federal Universal Service Fund for serving underserved areas. We have, as I'm sure a lot of people have seen in the press, a lot of activity with a new foreign investment law in the U.S. revising how the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States reviews new foreign ownership in existing businesses, and new processes for non-controlling investments. So it's not just control investments, but something less than controlling that could be subject to review, and also with real estate transactions. And of course, depending on how you're arranging your landing arrangements in the United States, you could have challenges there. We have a new process being administered by the Commerce Department for reviewing ICT and services transactions that involve what the United States government identifies as foreign adversaries. And this is a completely new review process that could lead to blocking or unwinding of transactions to the extent that they affect U.S. ICT, and that's the subject of a very contentious rulemaking right now in front of the Commerce Department. It lacks bright line rules, it's potentially extraterritorial, it's potentially retroactive, and it welcomes input from private parties about transactions, which is an invitation for private parties to kneecap their competitors. I'm not going to talk in detail about the procurement-related restrictions, other than to say, as with some of the export control restrictions we see coming out of the Commerce Department, there are a lot of restrictions that the U.S. government has imposed on dealings with Huawei and with ZTE in many different forms. And even the FCC, our telecoms regulator, is getting into the act. As you might have seen, last year, the FCC denied a carrier license for the U.S. subsidiary of China Mobile, but it is also involved now in supply chain issues, restricting the use of universal service subsidy funds for use in procuring equipment from Huawei or ZTE, asking should this be ripped out of all U.S. networks, regardless of whether or not they receive subsidies. Big issues. And so there's a lot out there, and I just want to make sure that everybody's aware that it's not just Team Telecom that is the national security issue for this sector.
So just backing up a little bit to the M&A activity that's up on the screen right now. I read a stat somewhere that was talking about 600 and something telephone companies in the world condensing to about 200 over the next 5 to 7 years. Are you seeing that M&A activity ramp up?
I think it goes in cycles. I think we're going through another boom cycle right now, but part of it just tracks where the economy is. We're also seeing a number of insolvencies, so I think that I don't know that there's any great pattern over time other than to say it's just in cycles. I don't think that it's a crescendo that's going to continue at the current rate.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Just want to bounce back to Ed for a moment. We talked about the evolution of SLTE to where it is today. You talked about 800 1 terabit cards. Where's it going? I mean, what do you realistically expect to see being deployed in the context of cards by, say, 2025?
So first of all, it also depends on the cable, and the ability to get more on a card is far greater with a new fibre rather than a fibre that is aging. But I think if you look at, say, a trans-Pacific distance on a new cable, I would say we're now in the 500 to 600 gigabit wave area on a new cable.
Right
so
now.
In other words, what that is a single card that is programmable, capable of running at that level. You might use the same card on a legacy cable, but at a much lower throughput. So depending on the cable and say over 10,000 kilometers, you have the potential for 500 gig plus. And that will go up more, whether it'll be 800 or a terabit by 2025, hard to say, but it's going in that direction.
And is the cost for an 800 gig card going to be the same cost as a current 100 gig card?
Well, actually, it's not. It's actually going to be a lot cheaper than the price we used to pay, or you used to pay for 40 gig.
You've heard it here. Oh, hang on. No, they were really expensive, Ed.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we're actually seeing that, the main efficiency on the vendor side is that components are being taken out of the network. And, a single modem has got so much greater capacity and so much more built-in software as well. And so now it's normal to price on the basis of equivalent 100 gig pricing.
Right, so theoretically, I buy two 800 gig cards, one for each end. I can program it to whatever size wavelength I like and in between, or multiples thereof, pretty much.
Yep.
Well, interesting times ahead, that's for sure, in the SLTE space. So I just want to get back to Nigel for a minute. I'm intrigued with what's happening in your business at the moment. You have AEC1, AEC2. You're looking at other builds. Can you give us an overview of what's driving you to continue to focus on the Atlantic? Are you looking at doing something maybe further south? Looking at interconnecting with some of these places in the Middle East or Africa, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, all of the above, really. I think we've followed a strategy, and I think there's a number of others around the world on that map who are following the same strategy of sticking to the infrastructure layer and, being the widest kind of opening to the carrier market in a carrier-neutral way. So you see these carrier-neutral organisations around the world, RTI, so other areas have other people who focus specifically on this. And our view is that it's an infrastructure model. We have infrastructure capital, and we're just trying to be super efficient at running the infrastructure for the widest possible customer base, which is the different carriers on either side of the Atlantic at the moment. And potentially what makes sense is to move out from the Atlantic, maybe with some of the regional systems, and down into the Mediterranean, as you said, and maybe even be a home for some of the Arctic stuff that might come down into Ireland. Ireland's in a great place, stuck on the edge of Europe there, nearer to the US slightly. and it has a fairly good sort of regime from a tax perspective, and also now from a licensing and permitting. You know, there's a bunch of stuff been done in Ireland over the last year to make it more straightforward to obtain landing licenses and, you know, go through a smoother process to continue this growth that Ireland has around the digital economy. But we're also, you know, potentially offering, you know, outsourced operation solutions and different things. We're just saying very, very focused in this one place. You know, we're not suddenly going to start selling IoT or, you know, doing terrestrial networks. There's this, I don't know what you call it, whether you call it layers of the industry or, you know, just different super focuses. What the transaction that was on the end of that thing, the Zayo EQT, you know, that huge transaction around terrestrial fibre, fantastic. They focus on terrestrial fibre. We don't ever touch terrestrial fibre, we only touch submarine fibre. So people are finding their places to be, you know, to focus their talent, their money, their investors, you know, desire.
It's an interesting point about outsourcing ops potentially, because are you guys seeing a trend now developing where, you know, back in the day with new cable systems, you know, you'd be out there talking to people about multiple 100 gigs or 100 gig wavelengths as a pre-sale for a new system. We're seeing now a trend developing in our business where people really just want to talk about fibre pairs and partial fibre pairs in a pre-SIF context. So if we get to a situation where people are buying spectrum or they're buying entire fibre pairs, is that where your head's at in the context of, you know, outsourced services to those sort of people?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but that, if you really go back 20 or 30 years, that's not that much different to the consortium model of 20, 30 years ago, where maybe one party provided the NOC in the consortium, one party provided the AR&R, and one party provided, you know, network administration. That was a form of outsourcing that each party did a piece for the game, but there were only a fixed number of parties either side of the Atlantic that actually built systems between each other. Since deregulation, the number of parties that want this are much bigger, much wider, much more diverse. Some of them have got, you know, slightly different requirements. So it's, in reality, it's the same as it was, but it's very much different now with a focus on efficiency, you know, and artificial intelligence even driving into, you know, alarm conditions on the systems. You know, the equipment that Ed and all the other vendors supply, the equipment that the underlying subsea you know, builders provide, the Subcom, Xtera, ASN, is much more, you know, self-resilient. And so everything's become a lot more efficient. And the operation costs tends to be the thing that really bites people after a few years of service, right? You know, you can find a way of reducing your debt by paying down, by selling the fibre pairs in a matrix. But it's really the operational cost that's the thing which you have to continues to make as efficient as you possibly can. Okay.
We're just about running out of time, so what I'd like to do is I'll start down the other end with Helen. I'll give you each about a minute, a bit of a wrap-up. So if there's any key thoughts or messages you want to leave folks with, now's the time to do it. So, Helen?
Okay. I guess for Asia Pacific, there's lots of countries there, right? We look at it's anywhere between up to 30 places. And if you look at just SJC alone, it's got 11 landing stations. So I guess the challenges in Asia region is more than just where the political sensitivity all that is. It's still a lot of growth between the technology drivers that behind it, the applications, and also the social responsibility aspect when you look at all the islands that we're trying to get internet into there. So there is a lot of different pools on what we need to do in Asia to strengthen the capacity, the cables to serve the countries. And you look at it, even for China, despite I know Ken's point on, yes, the political sensitivity is a factor, but China's still growing. So Hong Kong will stay there either as a gateway or as a transit point. It cannot be forgotten. So yes, so a lot's going on and we'll keep an eye on it.
Okay, so the wrap on that is that the Pacific's booming and there's still lots of scope for intra-Asia. Ed?
Yeah, I would say technology has really done its job. I think you're going to see continuing improvement in unit costs. And I would just say, to add to what Helen was saying, don't forget about legacy cables either, in terms of cables that are critical infrastructure for islands, for lowly trafficked routes. You know, technology will benefit those as well in terms of reducing their cost, adding to their capacity, and in some cases extending their life as well.
Okay, Byron, any final thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for that. The legacy systems are very important, I think, continue to play a key role. But yeah, I think, you know, if you look at Africa, and I'll speak to Africa in particular, just because I think while you're seeing all this activity on the subsea side, and obviously this is a panel to talk about subsea investments, but the amount of terrestrial infrastructure development that needs to happen in Africa to really extract the value from the new cable systems that are being built is huge. You know, even at CECOM, we built the cable in 2009, and in the past 10 years, most of our investments since then have been in terrestrial backbone, backhaul, you know, terrestrial links across Africa where we can build them. And that's going to continue for years and years to come. So even to extract the value from the Equiano system and the other unannounced systems, those 16 fiber pairs, where's that capacity going to go? And I mean, that terrestrial infrastructure development is a huge challenge in Africa.
So, in summary, to have a successful submarine cable system, you need lots of interconnectivity at either end of it. Otherwise, it's not much chop. Kent, any final thoughts?
Yes, I was just going to make 3 brief points. I think I've said my piece about security issues, but I just wanted to note it's often, in dealing with government agencies, difficult to distinguish between the politics and the technical security risks. And a lot of what we're seeing right now looks like politics, and trying to have a brass tacks discussion about security doesn't always go very far, which is frustrating. I was going to circle back to the very first thing we talked about with Arctic systems, and note that this is certainly something that ICP is thinking about in terms of the bundle of environment issues. We see an increasing desire to protect sensitive ocean areas. The Arctic Ocean is certainly one of them. We have a fisheries treaty that already governs the Arctic now. And I think that that's something the industry needs to pay attention to. We have ongoing negotiations at the UN on the BBNJ treaty, which could create marine protected areas on the high seas, which could affect where you route new systems and how easy it is to repair existing ones. And so, again, with regulatory risks, this is part of the route calculus. And finally, with seabed mining, I was going to note that we've made some great progress there with our allies, with various governments, and now have draft regulations that are not finalized, but include all of our asks in protecting submarine cables. And that's great progress because particularly, again, right now in the Pacific, this has been a big issue for certain systems that have been developed, but the International Seabed Authority, which regulates deep seabed mining globally, has jurisdiction on the seabed beyond national jurisdiction globally. There are other resources out there. We could see activity in other ocean areas, particularly the Atlantic. So keep an eye on that.
Okay, thanks, Ken. And last but not least, Nigel.
I think you've got to balance the environmental factors, and obviously trying to keep parts of our planet as pristine as we can is a great thing, but you have to balance that with although we spend a gazillion CO2 miles to get here every year and have this conference, actually what we do, how much of that actually reduces CO2, air miles, pollution, etc., and negative effects on the environment simply by the fact you don't have to fly across an ocean to just do business anymore. You can feasibly do as much of it as possible electronically, and the bigger the cable, the more rich the electronic experience is, the more rich the mobile technologies and drivers give you the higher quality access mechanism, then you can reduce that in general business. So we shouldn't always beat ourselves up for being maybe on the negative side. We do take vast quantities of oil and copper and throw it into the sea and spend a lot of money doing that, but it's actually driving some really positive things for the environment, in my view. And I think, I think things will continue the same. There's we started off talking about your wonderful talk up to the bankruptcy story, but like that's just a natural. It's a little bit like what they're saying the heating effect of the Earth is doing. It's a natural reaction to what's been going on in any particular market. So it's fairly normal. It just tends to be fairly violent and in big chunks as opposed to gradual and over a longer period of time. So maybe by more combination of our needs for different oceanic routes, we reduce the fact that there'll be these big drops and big, clatters in the market.
Thanks, Nigel. So,
You see Elaine's glasses. They're coming down like this. So
no, I get it. I was just going to... I hear you like you're talking out loud. So I'd just like to, like everyone, to give our panellists a hand thank you. They've done a great job this morning. And I'll hand back over to Tony.
Thanks so much. It's been fascinating, and we could probably talk for hours more, but I do appreciate everyone's preparation and time, and certainly your insights. So it's been great so far. And some of the things that we talked about, there has been this relationship between, and I talked about it a little bit earlier, between submarine cables and satellites. So our next presenter is from the satellite world, and he's going to talk about some of the symbiosis between satellite and cable. And I'd like to bring up Mr. Robert Subert from Intelsat.
Why, hello everyone, and to Elaine and Paul, I'd like to thank you for your invitation to allow me to speak at today's event. And before I start, could I just have a show of hands as to who might be from the satellite industry in this audience? I have one person, two people, three, another person's admitted to it. Okay, so I'll be looking to you for moral support during this presentation, okay? But my objective today, ladies and gentlemen, is to give you a sense of where the satellite industry is going. And more importantly, by the end of this presentation, I hope that we all get a sense of how we can collaborate a little bit more closely. I think develop economic and commercial solutions which will see the growth of both of our products continue into the new decade. So let us begin by speaking about the renaissance which the satellite industry is going through right now. It's quite interesting to listen to your conversation. It reminded me a lot of where satellite was about 5 years ago, where we were talking about oversupply and what we're going to do with it, the pressures on unit cost, etc. But over the last 3 years, you've seen organisations who have got a lot of money get very, very interested in the satellite sector. You've got a couple of brands there which you all know extremely well. Now, I don't think that they're interested in just helping out the other 4 billion people on this planet which remain unconnected. I think that there are other market segments as well which these organisations are chasing, and who are going to start chasing these market segments very, very rapidly. But before I move on, let me just put a line in the sand, I should say, just to give you a sense of where the satellite industry is today. So we're about an $11 billion industry per annum. Since Sputnik, we've put about 9,000 satellites into orbit. Today, there's probably about 2,000 operational satellites, from GPS to weather satellites and communication satellites. So that's where we are today in terms of infrastructure, with companion ground segments to interconnect into cable systems to take those services anywhere they need to. The interesting thing as well is, in the satellite industry right now, we're going through quite a bit of change in the channel-to-market, go-to-market distribution. If you think about our value chain, you've got the satellite manufacturers, the Boeings, the Airbuses of the world. They typically then provide those satellites to satellite operators like Intelsat, SES, Eutelsat, to name a few. And then that goes back towards telecommunications companies, satellite service providers, who will typically sell their services to government, to media, to ISPs, so on and so forth. So that's really our value chain. So a lot is changing as we speak, especially when we consider the calibre of these entrants. And I'll speak to what we're actually doing very, very soon. So let's talk about the network of tomorrow. Now, I don't want to get bogged down into our acronyms, but you'll see up the very top GEO, MEO, and LEO. Now, the traditional satellite operator has been in the geostationary orbit, which is 36,000 kilometres into space. And when you think about that, that's what really led to a lot of growth in the submarine cable industry as it substituted from satellite. You know, we were doing about 550 milliseconds of latency, whereas cable could provide a far quicker alternative to that. And then we saw, perhaps 5 years ago, MEO, the MEO constellation, Middle Earth orbit, become populated by SES or O3b. And they helped reduce the latency challenge even further by operating at 8,000 kilometres in altitude. And more recently, LEO, Low Earth Orbit. Now, we heard of Iridium. Most of you have heard about Iridium. That's been the most popular brand in that orbit. But we have seen about 15 filings with the FCC in the last 5 years for organisations wanting to go into the LEO space. And as you can see, we've got Elon Musk in there, we've got Jeff Bezos in there, all of the guys with lots of cash putting in thousands of satellites into that orbit. Why? Well, the latency there is circa 30 milliseconds. So again, it's taking a real, I suppose, terrestrial feel to solutions provided through satellite. But more importantly, what I'd like to talk to you about is what are the market segments which we're seeing develop? What's the pull through? What's creating the sale of megabits, gigabits, etc.? Well, it's some of those market segments that you see down the bottom there. Intelsat, for example, we focus a lot on things that move, so the mobility market, ships at sea, aircraft. To give you a sense, there's 70,000 deep water merchant marine vessels, a fraction are only connected, 25,000 commercial aircraft, again, a fraction only connected. We sell to government for military purposes. As I said, there are companies that have emerged which are very interested in the consumer market, ensuring that those which are unconnected become connected. We are also doing a lot of work expanding the reach of mobile network operators, dealing with outer islands, for example, in the Pacific. It's true everything that's been said here today. The team has done a great job in connecting, for example, Pacific Islands, but that typically stops at the main island, the capital city. They typically have a terrific terrestrial network there and a 4G network, but what do you do in the outer islands? And that's where about 20% of the population still lives. So we've got to figure out a way of how we get that population mass connected to the main island and then tromboning through the submarine cable system. And that's where satellite's coming in as well to provide that outer island connectivity. Okay, so let me take you real quick through what is happening in the satellite industry. I'll talk to these 4 blocks real quick. Let's talk about the satellite launch innovation. So when we launched a satellite in the past, we'd spend a lot of money on it. Typically $400, $500 million for an asset that would go up and last for 15 years. Now, the key cost components would be the satellite, $250 million, about $100 million for insurance, and about $100 million for a launch vehicle. Well, the dynamics, the economics are changing so quickly and so profoundly as we speak. We're seeing new organisations entering the rocket business. SpaceX, Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos, Mr. Amazon, Virgin Galactic, and a few more which I'll speak to later. But the key thing that these guys are doing, they're producing reusable rockets. So these things take a payload up into space and it comes back down, lands on a platform, fill it up, send it back up again, and it's reusable, dramatically reducing the costs. As a matter of fact, costs are going to be down at 20% of where they used to be. So you can see that the economics there are beginning to change the profile of satellite as a solution. A couple of organisations here, just to share with you the creativity of these organisations. Relativity are building out satellites, satellite rocket launchers, using the world's largest metal 3D printing robot. So they're printing these things out very rapidly, very quickly, sending satellites into space within 60 days. Rocket Lab, a Kiwi company, they're vertically integrating themselves. So they've got a launch pad as well as building rockets. Again, they're managing a lot of the costs, ripping costs out, making it much more cheaper. Virgin, they're strapping rockets under the wing of a 747 aircraft, and as it flies and reaches an altitude of 35,000 feet, the rocket deploys and carries off into space for deploying the LEO satellite. So there's a whole bunch of really innovative things happening on the launch side which are reducing costs. So let's get to the next block, spacecraft innovation. So, as I mentioned, we used to spend $500 million to build a satellite that's going to last 15 years, and it's going to squirt a whole bunch of energy on a specific landmass. We used to call them wide beams. The kicker is that these satellites used to have a maximum capacity of 6 gigabits. So you're launching $500 million, you're only going to get 6 gigabits out of it, and it's going to stay up there for 15 years. No wonder we were considered expensive when you divide and make the maths come out on a spreadsheet. You can imagine how that needs to change and is changing. So what we did as an industry about 3 or 4 years ago, we really introduced high throughput satellites. Still a geostationary, but what we would do is radiate spot beams on a landmass. And when you're radiating a beam on a landmass, the energy's a lot higher. Therefore, the ground segment costs reduce, the megabit price reduces, and everybody starts to win. Now, what has now transpired is that we are moving further and further down the path of satellite or software satellite-defined satellites, which are going to do a lot more to reducing the total cost of ownership and increase the amount of throughput of those satellites. We are now seeing satellites designed to deal with 40 to 500 gigabits. I think Viasat in the next 2 years are going to bring to the Pacific another satellite which is going to deliver a terabit of data. So we're seeing capacity coming our way in large volumes. I mentioned software-defined payloads. This is going to be a massive shift in the direction we're going. We're going to build satellites which are going to be configured once they're launched. What we've been doing for forever now is building satellites, we're sending them into space, and the beams that they're spraying on the ground stay fixed for 15 years. What we're going to do now is change those satellite beams as the market evolves. So if all of a sudden Papua New Guinea becomes a hot spot of demand, we're going to direct all our power there rather than having it on top of Fiji, for example. And the time to build these things will be a lot quicker, they'll become a lot cheaper. And that's the key message of, could we say, high throughput satellite 2.0. But let me get to this slide. It gives you an indication of how these spot beams are positioned. They look a lot like cell sites or mobile phone base stations, and that's what they are fundamentally. They're positioned, they're providing a blanket of coverage over the globe, but we switch on the beam that we need to provide capacity of a certain market that needs that capacity. Moving on, because I'm running out of time very quickly, let me get to constellation innovation. Now, this is the stuff that is really the aha moment, I think, for everyone in this room. Let me just provide you a few metrics of what our LEO industry colleagues are doing. So OneWeb is launching 640 satellites. They've put about 10 up at this point. They're going to be contributing about 1.2 terabits per constellation, and these LEOs are constantly moving. So they're constantly moving, and that has an effect on the ground segment, which I'll touch on soon. Starlink, which is Mr. Musk's empire, is going to put up 12,000 satellites. Now, I think by tomorrow they will have put 250 satellites up there. And they are going to be operating, as I said, in a low Earth orbit constellation. You can see that they'll be providing about 23 terabits of capacity. The interesting thing is that when you get to a size constellation like that, even when you get to, say, 5,000 satellites, you're going to have to be replacing, after they give you 5 years of life, 20 satellites a week. So they're going to be sending rockets up there constantly, replenishing their network. Project Jupiter, which is Jeff Bezos or the Amazon empire, they're going to be contributing 3,500 satellites. And there's probably another 3 organizations there which I haven't even commented on. So lots of capacity, providing coverage to almost every inch of the Earth's surface apart from the poles. Okay, moving on to the last bit. So we've spoken about the space industry, the new economics, the innovation that we've done in space. But you've got to remember that most of this is low Earth orbit, middle Earth orbit, etc. And if you've done the innovation in space, you've got to do the innovation on the ground as well. You can't have the traditional parabolic antennas that you see on every rooftop pointing at a LEO. It's just not going to work. You can't have that many moving parts on a remote island in the Pacific where that system is going to fail in a few days or months because of salt corrosion. We need to move to non-moving parts. And you can see examples there of what we call phased array technology, where you have antennas which you just put on a rooftop or you put on a car and it finds the satellite. It tracks the satellite, creates the connectivity. So life is going to be simplified immensely. Moving on very quickly to give you a sense of some of the projects that we're working on. Intelsat is working at the moment on the connected car. So Toyota, I think by next year, will be rolling out cars with little phased array antennas put in their rooftops, so that as they're driving around, we will be doing multicasts of updating software packages for them, so they don't need to take those cars to the mechanic anymore. It'll all be done as it's sitting in your driveway or you're driving down the streets. That is one of many applications where we're seeing the connected world take place. Certainly that extends also to aircraft, where we're seeing fuselage built panels which will be moulded to the spacecraft framework, and it will also provide connectivity to anything that moves in the air, business jets, commercial aircraft, so on and so forth. The biggest market that we see emerging out of all of this is comms on the move or comms on the pause. In other words, trucks, buses, railway systems. If you think about Australia, Western Australia, 70% of the world's autonomous vehicles operate there in our mining and resources organisations. So there's huge demand. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think I've done it in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
All right, I think we are coming to the next part of the session, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the, I think we're going to a break, actually, sorry. This is actually the time for the poster session. And so if you take a look on both sides of, both to my left and to my right, people have spent an awful lot of time working on some of these posters, and they're going to be positioned near them. And you know, please make yourself available. Come up, talk to anybody about any one of these activities that are going on throughout the world. So pretty important. Again, thanks an awful lot to Suboptic, and thanks again to Paul for bringing this concept forward to PTC. So with that, let's go to a break. Let's get to the posters, and then we'll be back at 10:45 and kick off the next segment. Thank you.
This video on how to use the Subtel cable. My name is Kieran Clark, lead analyst at Subtel Forum, and by the end of this video, you will have learned how to use the cable ships map layer to view the location and details of over 45 cable ships around the world. This layer is automatically updated every 6 hours to provide users with real-time information on the position and destination of all active cable ships. Clicking any of the cable ship icons on the map will bring up details for the selected vessel in the bottom left information pane. The cable ship layer is currently configured to display the name of the vessel, the timestamp of its most recently updated position, and its current destination. Expanding the cable ship's entry in the layers list will allow you to view all of the cable ships in list form. Clicking on a cable ship in this list will pan the map to your selection. You can also use the group filter to search for a specific cable ship. Select the cable ships group and input the name or partial name of a cable ship to filter matching results. Click on the filtered results in the layer list to pan to your selection. This concludes the tutorial on how to use the cable ships map layer to view the location and details of over 45 cable ships around the world. I hope you found this useful and encourage you to make a tool to learn more about the submarine cable and related industries. If you have any questions or comments, let me know at kclark@subtelforum.com. I'm always looking for feedback on how to improve this map. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to see all tutorials for the Subtel cable map. I'll see you next time to talk about more exciting features.
No, they're not here. They'll bring them out. The PTC people shortly.
We okay so far?
6, 7. Are you going to stay up here during my panel?
Nope, unless you want.
No, that's okay. I'm going to sit down, so just trying to think out.
No, the PTC will put the names out.
You did a great job.
Gee, great job. It's fantastic. We've all done
Absolutely
fantastic.
fantastic. No, you really kept them on. And Sean, you'd given Sean the due ahead of time, right?
Yeah, but that's excellent.